Today we're going to continue working with our wood, and we're going to turn it into a floor. This is a slightly different color. This is actually the test wood that I originally used for the previous set of videos, and it came out a slightly different color. But I wanted to show you this because we're actually going to be building this mask for the planks. And I have it hooked up on this one, so I'm just going to show it to you on this one. And what happens is that it's this node right here. It's using that same polish parameter that we had created in the previous set of videos. And as we bring the polish down on our wood, what it also does once it drops below 0.5 is it starts to mess with the actual seams between the wood itself, and it starts to rough it up so that our planks actually look rougher along with the wood getting rougher. And we're going to start by building this mask, and then we're going to build a new material like this using the wood that we had created in the previous set of videos. And I'm going to open this reference here so we can take a look at what we built. And all the procedural stuff is happening in this node that we then import and can reuse, by the way, with any wood material. That's why it doesn't really matter that I'm showing you another wood, because once you have this and you save it to your library, you can use it over and over again. So, without further ado, let's make a new substance. And we will call this basic planks to go ahead with our wood. And we have a brand new graph. Now we know that we're going to be using the same outputs. So I'm going to change this metallic to specular level, and we'll relabel it. And we'll put that down here. I'll bring this up next to my normal. And then we'll make a new output node for our ambient occlusion. The first thing I'm going to do is actually make the input parameters that I need. We're going to start with polish because we are going to, I mean, we could call it whatever we want. It's just simpler to call it polish because we know we're going to be hooking it up with the other one. And we'll leave this as a float 1, and we'll have our default as 1 with a minimum and maximum the way they're set now. I'm also going to make a couple more parameters that we're going to use in just a minute. The first one I'm going to call offset random. And this will determine the randomness of the offset on our planks on the x-axis. We'll set the default as 0. And that should be fine. And finally, I'm going to make an input for plank number. And this is going to determine, you know, how many planks we want in our material. And this will be actually an integer 1. And we'll set the minimum as 3 because it's not really going to read unless we have 3. You could set it down to 1 if you wanted. 0 isn't going to work because it actually needs a number. And we'll leave the rest like that. Next thing, I'm actually going to go and get a tile generator from the library. We're going to need one of each. And we're going to use these two tile generators in tandem to create both the mask and the color ID that we're going to need for the planks. And we're going to set them up so that they're using the same parameters, and if we want to adjust them, we're adjusting both of them at the same time. So let's start with the grayscale one. And we're going to use this to actually create the lines of our planks. first thing I'm going to do is just make it smaller. In fact, I'm going to bring this up to 2K. And I'm just going to bring this down to a 512 map. Same with this one. We're not going to need all that detail, and we'll ramp it up once we need it ramped up. Now we have to get this to look more like planks. So I'm going to bring this X all the way down to 1. And I'm going to bring this Y down to 6. And this gives us our spread. Currently, we have this brick pattern set in here. And I'm going to change that out right now so that we can get our settings straight without having to go back and change them later. We're not going to be using the brick shape. We're going to be using a gradient in here. But for now, just to set this up, I'm going to switch that out to just a white. And this way we can set up our image inputs. It would be the same as if we set it to a square in here, but this way we can get this in the right place as well, because it will be taking an image input. Right, so this isn't looking like much of anything at the moment, and I'm going to set in this like that, and that's going to change the way they relate, well, the way their middles relate to each other. And we'll set this in as well. We're still not seeing anything because we're not offsetting it yet, but I'm just going down the line just because it's easier. Now we get to the offset part. So the minute I start offsetting this, we're starting to get the effect that we want. And if I click on this and hit the space bar, it shows me how the texture looks tiled, and it's starting to look like planks. This offset random determines how these things relate to each other, and this is where we're going to put our offset random input. And it's currently set to 0. And what that's going to allow us to do then is to do what I just did with that slider. Now we're going to go back up here and replace this 6, this Y amount, with our plank number. And that's why you don't want it as 1, because it doesn't look like planks anymore. So that's kind of what I meant before, that you really need more than just 1 or 2, because 2 looks more like bricks, but the minute you start doing 3 and up, it starts looking more like planks. So we set it back up to 6, and we'll make that our default. And now we can see that, you know, we've got the beginnings of this plank pattern. Get rid of that tiling, but it's still got a long way to go. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up this gradient. And let's use this one, linear gradient 2. And the reason I want a gradient is I'm thinking about heights. And once we start turning these into wood planks, I don't want them 100% flat. I want there to be some kind of undulation in their heights. So that's why I'm adding this. Right now it's way too black and white, and I want this much gentler in the way that it does its grading. So I'm using a levels node to sort of just make it not quite so dark. And then the other thing that I need to do is looking at the direction of my little planks here, is I actually want this gradient running in the opposite direction. So I'm going to get a transform node, and I'm going to turn it by 90 degrees. The other thing I want to do is, there's no point in having this 2K if I have this at 512. So I'm going to go ahead and lower this down as well. And let's replace this white color with our gradient and see what it gives us. So now we have these planks that are kind of bowing a little bit towards the middle and then getting a little bit lower as they reach their seams. And this is great for our height maps, etc. We can always come back in here and change the relationship with the levels, so that's nice. But there are going to be situations where we actually just want this straight up black and white. So I'm going to get another levels node, and I'm going to get rid of those grays in the middle. And this brings us back down to the original tile generator before we applied the gradient to it. So now we have kind of two versions of this tile generator. And then we can come back down into our color tile generator and do almost exactly the same thing to it. I'm going to run down, I'm going to put these amounts in. Now, where this guy is going to differ is going to be in the number of inputs it has, which is going to be 3, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then the other thing, you'll notice that I didn't put numbers in here. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a negative 0.02 in the X and a 0 in the Y. And we'll see why in just a second. Let's get some inputs for this tile generator. I'm going to pick 3 distinct colors. And these are going to be colors that can be used for a color ID, which is what we're going to be using this for. And a color ID is a mask that allows you to mix more than 2 colors. This grayscale can only handle like a top color and something underneath, and blocking that top color out using grayscale. What a color ID does, it actually assigns these very specific colors to inputs, and then we can match them up and make a mask that way, as far as assigning specific areas in here to materials later on. I put this in the background instead of pattern input. Now it works. But we're kind of having a bit of a problem here, because when we use this as a color ID, it's really specific as to the color. So this color red and this color red aren't going to read as the same color, and it will end up messing up our mask. So we have to do, this is kind of a hack, but I found that this worked. I used a directional blur, and I'm still getting a little bit of difference in here. If you look really closely, you can see that's a slightly different red. That'll still give us some problems, but there are now problems that can be adjusted at the other end in the actual blend. This is already beginning to be within parameters of settings that I can handle in the multi-material blend, but I think I can still do better. So I'm going to come back into my tile generator, and looking at this color differential here as my guide, I'm going to mess around with my interstice number a little bit more. See how as I move that along, I'm changing that really subtle band. So I think 0.03 might actually work better than 0.02. And then the other thing I can do is ramp this intensity up. And that really washes out that line. And I'm trying to get this as even as I possibly can. I think this will work now, because I'm really not visually seeing a line. And we're going to create a new output for this, which we're going to call color ID. Yeah, so I just realized I actually made quite a big boo-boo. Not in what we did here, but in where we did it, because I had actually set this up as my final material with all the specular level and the AO and all of that. But we've already put in our input parameters here. So since we haven't actually started on the planks material, I'm just going to go ahead and change this to, I'm going to rename this to a plank mask. And we'll save this as plank mask. And we'll go ahead and just get rid of the stuff that we don't need. So we're not going to actually need any of these. We're going to need a couple of black and white ones, but that's it. And then when it comes time to making the actual floor, we'll just go ahead and make another graph for that, rather than starting to move things around and making our lives more complicated. So sorry about that. Don't know what I was thinking about, but clearly not what I'm doing here. So let's move on. We've got these two masks that are now working with the same input parameters, and they're doing the same thing. We've got it smeared, we've got the color ID smeared out in such a way that it's really gotten rid of any of the vertical bands. So when the time comes, this is how we're going to split up our pieces of wood. And each one of these is going to correspond to a wood texture input that we're going to put in there. And then this mask is going to make our actual plank. Now, since this plank mask we're making is going to be responding to that polish input, and that is going to also be related to the polish of the wood itself, I want the way in which the edges of the planks mess up as it gets rougher to, match with the wood. We've already made this noise mask in our original material, and I'm going to use that rather than making a new noise mask. So I'm going to copy this. I'm back in our original basic wood material. I'm copying it, and then we're going to get back to our plank mask. And I can paste that effects map in here. And since it doesn't require an input or anything, it's got, it's a self-contained little thing, we can do that, and it's going to work exactly the same way in this graph as it did in the original graph. But we're going to do stuff to it. I'm going to want two different sizes of this for sort of the various things that we're going to do with it. And one we're going to make twice the size, and the other we're going to do 4 times. So we'll do this one 4. So I hit the 2x button twice. And on this one, I'm hitting the 2x button once. And we now have the same pattern, it's just at a different scale. And it means things are going to match. So now that we've got our noises, we can start to manipulate that mask. First thing I'm going to do is get a slope blur. And I'm going to take this clean version of the mask, the one without the height information, and we're going to use the 2 times, the smaller of the 2 enlargements on this guy, and we can bring this down so that the intensity is actually really low, but it's messing with that edge. We are going to put an input parameter on this, so I'm not going to worry too much about how exact this is, because it's going to get handled by a function. But as the wood gets roughed up, this is beginning to break up that line. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a warp. And we're going to do the same sort of thing to this, only for this one, we're going to use the 4 times enlargement. And again, we're going to handle this by function, but for the moment I'm just going to bring it down so we get an idea of what it looks like. So we have these 2 different kinds of noises happening to our line, and we're going to blend them together using a darken blend. And that'll be the overall effect. And now what we're going to do is we're going to build functionality into these 2 nodes that will scale up and down as we go through our polish slider. So let's start with the slope blur. We're going to go into our intensity, we're going to click on the function, and we're going to click empty function. And then we click on it again to edit. So we know we're going to need our polish variable. And the other thing I know I want is I don't want any of this roughening happening until it gets to be smaller than 0.5. And therefore I need to set up a comparison. So if my polish is greater than or equal to 0.5, then as far as the edges of my planks are concerned, it's 100% polished. Otherwise, whatever the polish input is. And this becomes my basic polish input for this particular slope blur. Now, since we are relating this to the wood, I can also go ahead and use those functions that I had created in the previous videos. So my polish bracket and my polish inverse will work just as well here as they did in the wood. And I'm going to invert this input because when the polish is high, it's getting taken care of here, but then I want it inverted once we're actually starting to calculate what's happening in this particular slope blur. And here I'm just going to plug in the numbers that I had. And one more constant. So my polish is this. My low number is 0. And then this becomes my high number because we don't really want this number going high at all. And we set this as our output node. And currently our polish is set to 1. And as we move that down below 0.5, that slope blur at least is starting to do what it needs to do. Now, as luck would have it, we actually want the exact same thing in our warp. So I'm going to go back into this function. I'm going to copy everything. We're going to go into our warp, and we'll do exactly the same thing here. We'll paste it in, and we'll set it as the output node. And now if we look at it again, as it goes below 0.5, it's doing both things. I'm not really digging exactly how it's doing both things, but we're going to adjust that. So I'm still not digging it. I think it's in this one. Let's adjust this number up a little bit. Yeah, that's better. Because I want to see those edges kind of, you know, like look like they've got splinters coming out of them. Anyway, you said, you know, again, this is a very personal aesthetic choice. We've got this little section done. So we've got the deep grooves of the planks sorted out, but it's like a really straight edge right now, height-wise. And I want to create more subtle noises along the edges. And to do that, we're gonna need to make a mask that's gonna create kind of this wider, rough edge. First thing I want is an invert grayscale. And we're gonna invert this slope blur. And then we're gonna get a directional blur. And I'm gonna plug in what I had in my notes. But we're just starting to manipulate that to give us kind of a wider, rougher edge. So here I had 1.74. And I turned it slightly. And then we're going to get a levels. And we're going to just tighten it up a bit so it's more. So that's a good basis for it. I want to use a warp on it next. And we're going to warp it against one of these guys. We're going to warp it against this bigger one. But again, I want this much more bold. So the first thing we're going to do is get a levels node and make it more bold. And then we're going to blur that. And according to my notes, I have it set as 1.5. So, you know, it just kind of takes the edge off a little bit. And then we can set our warp down to 0.1. Actually seems too high. That's better. Now this works okay up here in these long guys, but these are still very straight. So we're going to get a directional warp, and we're going to kind of do the same thing, but you'll notice that here it's really wiggling up the vertical ones and kind of leaving the horizontal ones alone. So we'll just blend the two together, and we'll use a lighten blend. And now we can adjust this because we're making a mask, so we don't really want those black spaces in there. And now it's created for us a rough edge in the middle as well. And we can put this levels node in here, which we can then use to manipulate how this mask is either turned on or off. I'm going to make a little bit more room here. And now we can get a blend node. And using the mask that we've just created, we're actually going to want an inverse of this. So let's get an invert grayscale. I want the inverted, but we're going to have to fool around with it a little bit. But it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's just not nearly dark enough. So we'll get another levels node. Oh, and let's fix our parenting problems. I'm going to switch this one right here. Right now it's getting its input from the previous node, and we're going to switch that for it to get its input relative to the parent, and that's going to bring our resolutions up to where they need to be. This is okay here because we left that at a high resolution. We might as well set this one again relative to parent, and everything else is fine. So we now have, these should be dark areas in here. And we have to get our masks squared away so that they're working the way we need them. So I think what's going on inside there is okay now. I want some variation, but I want it to be mostly really dark. I want to see more of an edge here though, so we're going to have to come back into these two, I think, and work on those functions. That's better, because we want at least some line somewhere. So I think I'm pretty contented with that as a basic mask. Oh, we didn't even darken it, so it's going to be even better that way. And we're actually going to set this as one of our outputs. And I'm just going to make it a mask output. And we'll call it mask 1. The other thing we need to do is somehow incorporate these two and create an output for that. And that's pretty simple. We're just going to multiply them. And we have to, that's because it's coming straight off of this one. So we'll set this for it to be relative to parent, and that brings it up to size again. I'm going to click my space bar, make sure all of my tiling is correct, and that looks pretty good. And this is going to be our second output. And we're going to call this mask 2. Oh, you know what we didn't do? We didn't set up this thing. Because at the moment, our planks are set permanently to rough. So let's set our levels out high here to work with our polish. Now we're working on the inverse of polish, so we're going to get our variable polish. And we'll get a subtract. We're not going to do a multiplier. I'm just going to do it this way. Actually, I want it less than or equal to. We're only having it happen in sort of the bottom half of our roughness. For some reason, I had this set to 0.45, so I'll leave it at that. I don't know why it's not 0.5, but that's what it looks like in my notes. So if polish is less than 0.45, then I want my inverse of polish. Otherwise, I want 0. And let's see if this is working with what we've created here. Yeah, I was afraid of that. This needs to be flat when our polish is set to 1, and it's not. It's an easy fix. I just noticed it while I was doing the other thing. So that's set to 1. This is flat. This is not. So I want to take a look and see what's going on in here. That's why. Because it's a negative number. Yeah, it was I had inadvertently made that a negative number, so it was doing the opposite of what it needed to do. But I'm looking at the way this is fading in and out now, and I think I want to tweak what's going on in here. It's very smooth when it's going in through these middle bits, so I'm going to change this back to having it a lot more contrasty. Again, you know, these are sort of tweaks, like, it's personal, depends on what you want as far as the effects that you want. But the idea is to create this rough mask That's part of my problem right here, is that this is gray. I think that'll do for now. We can always adjust it later. But you know, there's a lot of tweaking going on, and it's always different every time a little bit. So I think we're going to leave it for now. We might futz around with it in the next video, but I'm going to call this done. And then in the next video, we're going to take this and we're going to actually make a new material where we're using the masks that we've created here to manipulate the basic wood texture that we made in the previous videos.